Welcome, everybody. Episode 222 of the Winning Momentum Podcast. I'm Scott Sinclair, your host. Welcome to the show. You know, the content that we do on this channel, the Winning Momentum Podcast and its predecessor show, Martinis with Scott, has really always been geared towards owner-managers, business owners, executives, entrepreneurs, anyone in business who's taking the risk of business and who's trying to do better, to achieve their goals, to make more money, to get through a crisis, to grow their business rapidly, to transition from here to there. That's always been, in my mind, the target, the audience of this show. Yet what I have found over the 222 episodes is that I often get young professionals and students who are interested in a career in this industry or a related industry, and they reach out to me and they ask questions about how to get into the business, about how to succeed in the business, about specific technical aspects of the business, how to do better in their career, and how to handle specific situations. And I try to answer. I love the engagement. I love the engagement from the audience. You know, when you do this sort of content, you just never know if anyone's listening. We're not live streaming anymore like we did a few years ago. We don't have a chat line. You get comments when you meet people, but is anybody really paying attention when you're a content creator, unless you're super successful at it and not doing anything else? You know, I run many businesses. But when you're a content creator, often you're just wondering, who the hell's listening to this? Is anybody listening to this? And so I love the engagement. I love the audience feedback, the audience questions, and it gives me topics to talk about. You just never know. You just never know who is listening. And so I love the engagement when people reach out and ask questions. And as often as possible, I try to answer those questions during the show, on the theory that there's perhaps other listeners that might have the same sort of thoughts or the same sort of questions. And so that's the way I try to go about it. Now, often there's questions that are more personal, more private. I mean, the questioner saying, hey, this is going on in my life. What do you think? Or in my career, what do you think? And then I don't do those on the show. I try to be respectful with those. But where possible, I look to answer those questions here for the benefit of everybody. So I had a question a few weeks ago that I'd like to dedicate this show to, which was around the role of a CRO, a Chief Restructuring Officer. What exactly does a Chief Restructuring Officer do? What does it take to be successful in that business? And this person I don't know, but appears to be a young professional who has switched their career or is looking to switch their career into this line of business. And along the lines of what I had said about audience members reaching out, had reached out with this sort of question. So we're going to tackle that today because I think it fits in the context. It seems like a very specific question that maybe is not applicable to everybody in my audience. But, we talk a lot about transitional leadership, turnaround leadership, and that's really what a Chief Restructuring Officer is, despite the name that's attached to it. When we talk about a Chief Restructuring Officer, we're talking really about diving into the nuts and bolts of the relationship between the troubled company and the intended turnaround leader, in this case being the CRO, and what are those roles and responsibilities of each party. Now, I do want to say before we start on this that the answer to the question and the specifics of the answer, what is a CRO, how do you be successful, what are the roles and responsibility, is very much jurisdiction and circumstance dependent. All right, so as a result, I'm going to try to keep my answers a little more generic, all right? And I'm going to give them to you from my typical frame of reference, which may not be your frame of reference. I get these questions from all over the world, And the answers are different in different jurisdictions. I think this answer came out of Atlanta. This question came out of Atlanta, somewhere like that. A lot of my context is in the Toronto or the Canadian market or in the Northeast United States. So I've worked in 27 countries, I think, something like that in the world. And, in this business for over 30 years. So I have a lot of experience across different jurisdictions, but I'm not current on each one. If I were to step into your jurisdiction, I would have to get myself current in the legal framework and the procedures for restructuring a company and where I might fit into that normal course restructuring of a business. Okay. So just know that I'm going to talk more broadly, but wherever you are in the world and wherever you're doing this sort of work, you need to be mindful that the jurisdiction dictates a lot of the formal part of restructuring, even some of the informal part of restructuring, and the circumstances, formal, informal type of company, registered creditors sort of drive a lot of the process as well. Okay. So I'm going to give the answer more broadly, as I said, and I do want to, as a part of that, just acknowledge that in many of the jurisdictions that I work in, people in my community, lawyers, accountants, bankruptcy trustees, monitors in a restructuring process, receivers, when they hear the word CRO or the acronym CRO, what's going on in their mind is they're thinking that is a court-appointed position, okay, a court-appointed Chief Restructuring Officer that is there to aid the company through a formal filing bankruptcy procedure in court, all right? And that's often the case. And what I'm going to talk about today is a broader perspective than that, because while it's absolutely true that CROs are often appointed pursuant to a court order, and they're there as part of a formal restructuring procedure, they're also very often appointed as an advisor or a turnaround person outside of a formal filing. All right. And so if you're a lawyer and your job is bankruptcy law, and your job is helping companies go to court and seek the aid of the court to restructure its affairs, well, you're not really thinking about solutions outside of going to court to help a company restructure its affairs, right? But if you're a turnaround leader, if you're there to help a company succeed, the going to court, the formal procedure is a tool. It's a tool that sometimes is necessary to get the job done, but not always. But you can play the role of CRO, Chief Restructuring Officer, inside and outside of court, okay? And as a result, I personally have acted as Chief Restructuring Officer, CRO, with the benefit of court protection. It's part of a formal filing of the company. I'm appointed CRO in the court records. I get the protections of the court in terms of indemnities. We'll talk about that in a minute. I've been appointed Chief Restructuring Officer to a company privately by engagement letter as opposed to court order. And I do not have the protections of a court because there is no formal filing. There is no court. I've been appointed effectively Chief Restructuring Officer, CRO, but under different titles in a private engagement. One example would be Chief Restructuring Advisor, a CRA. And the distinction there is to try to really hammer home the point that you're a consultant. You're not a principal in this situation. You're not an officer. You're not a part of the management team. You're an advisor. I have been called on several occasions a CTO, Chief Transformation Officer. And the idea here is I don't want as a private appointment, I'm the company, I don't want the stigma perhaps, or the perceived stigma of saying, oh my goodness, I'm insolvent. I need a Chief Restructuring Officer. I need the work, but I just don't want that out to the marketplace. And so I just acknowledge up front that I'm going through a transition with my business, and I'm going to hire this Chief Transformation Officer to take us through this transformation of our business. And so to me, it's the same engagement letter. It's the same work. All right. But I just want you to know, if you're thinking about this business, which is what the question was, that, you can be privately appointed outside of court. You can be appointed in a court process as part of a formal filing. You can be called a bunch of different things. By the way, I've done the same work as interim CEO. I've done the same work as a director with protections, right? And so there's all sorts of titles that you can take to basically end up doing the same thing. And what are those things? What are those basic things that you need to do? Well, let's start with just talking really briefly about the 3 core things that almost every troubled business needs. What might those be? Well, number 1, and that doesn't mean it's the most important, so in no particular order, but number 1 would be a restructuring of the balance sheet. You have too much debt on your balance sheet and you can't pay everybody today, and that debt needs to be restructured. That's a balance sheet restructuring. And very often a troubled company is troubled by definition because it can't pay its bills and it's in trouble to pay back its debt. And so there's some hostility generating out of that, and you need to restructure, right? Okay, so there's one thing that often needs to be done in a troubled business, restructuring of the balance sheet. Another thing, number 2, that needs to be done very often in a troubled business is what we would call an operational turnaround. The company needs to make money or more money. Often it's losing money, and you need to find a way to cut costs, increase margins, do the things that I talk about on this channel to make more money. All right. Now, are there situations where a company needs an operational turnaround, but its balance sheet is okay? Yeah, that happens all the time. Is there a situation where a company is over-levered and has a balance sheet liquidity problem, but operationally it's pretty solid? Yeah, that happens all the time. So you don't necessarily have to have both of those things in the turnaround of a business, but often you need to have both of those things. And then the third thing is access to capital. It takes money to change. It takes money to take out the secured creditor and some of the other creditors, and to fund the proposal to unsecured creditors that you're doing in your restructuring. All of these things take cash. It takes money to lay off a bunch of people, to grow a business segment, to wind down this business, to cut costs. All of those actions take working capital, and you need to be able to get access to money, both for the working capital and to take out other old creditors, right? And so 3 things that most troubled companies need. They don't always need all 3. They don't always need 2 out of 3. They for sure need 1, otherwise there's no job. And very often they need all 3. In my experience, a restructuring of the balance sheet, operational turnaround, and some investment banking access to capital. I've talked before on this channel about a restructuring turnaround I was working on, and was appointed Chief Restructuring Officer in Canada of a automotive company. I won't get into the details of this, but this was a company that had lost money forever. It had never made money after the first generation owner and manager of that business had passed. Kids took over, and this thing just started losing money. It was extraordinarily complicated. They'd lost trust with their creditors, and they were grossly over-levered. They had enough value in the business to more or less get out the first secured creditor, but the second secured creditor that was owed a substantial amount of money, there was no hope in paying out that second secured creditor any meaningful payment. And so what did that company need? It needed to restructure its balance sheet because it had no hope of paying the second secured creditor, and therefore 0 possibility of paying the unsecured creditor. It needed an operational turnaround because at the end of the day, you need to make money. And if part of your restructuring plan on your balance sheet is to offer some upside, I'm going to give you some money today, a little bit of money, and then you grow with the business that's growing and you get some upside to get more return on this debt. Well, for that, there has to be an operational turnaround. There has to be a plan to actually make money and create value in the future. And the first secured creditor in this situation needed out. The company needed more working capital. And so it had the access to capital, the investment banking requirement. And so there's an example of a business I have talked about on this channel before that had all three requirements of making more money, restructuring the balance sheet, and getting the investment banking done. So a chief restructuring officer, regardless of your title, CRO, CRA, CTO, interim executive, interim director, whatever, a turnaround leader, a CRO, can and should contribute on all three of those points. Okay, you can and should contribute on a balance sheet restructuring. You can and should contribute on an operational turnaround, and you can and should contribute on the investment banking. Now, there are many CROs in the world, and most of them specialize in one out of those three things. In my practice, we do all three. Okay. Not as for example, we're not a licensed trustee, and therefore we're not also a monitor and a receiver and that sort of stuff, but we have experience in all three of those things, the restructuring, the turnaround improvement, and the investment banking, which makes us, I think, a unique proposition in that world. But you'll find if you were to look at the market, there's individual turnaround management experts in specific industries, but they know nothing about restructuring or very little about restructuring. They certainly don't know anything about investment banking. There's all sorts of pure restructuring turnaround people that, come out of insolvency shops, and they're probably accountants or finance people, but they're not roll up the sleeves, make more money, interim executive types of people, and they're not investment bankers. And there's investment bankers that do none of the other two things, right? And so it's unusual. It's unusual to get all three disciplines or areas of practice under one roof or in one individual. And when you ask what it takes to be successful, attack as many of those three things in your career as you possibly can would be one tip. Now, why would a company want a CRO to help them with these three things? And, one reason would be that the incumbent management often finds the process of tending to the day-to-day business, the operational issues, overwhelming enough. And then when you add the demands of a restructuring process, of trying to raise money, of trying to sell a business on top of running it, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And another point to add to that is a restructuring conversation is a negotiation. And the negotiation needs to start with honesty, openness, with integrity, with, here's all the bad things and how we're going to address them. That's also part of a turnaround plan. It's just facing reality. It's a rare individual, a unicorn, to be somebody that can both have that pragmatic, realistic, brutally honest type of restructuring mindset, yet also be the positive, optimistic, run the business, go out and sell more product, goods, or services during the same day. It's really hard. As I always say to prospective new clients, when this topic comes up, if it comes up, I just say, look, remember what you used to want to do when you got into business. Remember what made you successful. You go off and do that. Go off and do that. Go make some money. Make the business better. I'll handle all the shit that you're spending 15 hours a day on that's killing you. It's creating stress, it's creating fear, it's creating paralysis, and you're ignoring your business and everything's going off a cliff. I'll deal with that stuff. And you go off and do what you do well, which is the whole reason that you're here. So that is a role of a CRO. You are the person on the management side of the table, right? dealing with the things that they shouldn't be dealing with because you're an expert. They're not an expert. They should go and spend their time on what they're good at, presumably, which is running their business. And the second reason that there should be a CRO involved is, look at that, I've preempted myself. The second reason is just expertise, as I had just said. So management doesn't have the time, they're overwhelmed, but also the CRO is the expertise at the complexities in the specific jurisdiction of dealing with a restructuring, dealing with the investment banking, raising more capital, and dealing with the operational turnaround. Now, that doesn't mean, if I fly into San Antonio, something that came up today, if I fly into San Antonio to be a chief restructuring officer, do I need to be an expert in that state at their bankruptcy laws, at U.S. federal bankruptcy laws, at the processes and restructuring and solvency turnaround community in that area? Do I need to be an expert at that? No. What I do need to know is I need to know enough to ask the right questions and get the right professionals on my side. That's what you do as a CRO. If you're someone who's moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, which most successful CROs have to do. By the way, I say I've worked in 27 countries doing this work and thereabouts anyways. That's not because someone in Denmark called up Scott to hire me to turn around their business. That doesn't happen. What happens is you start working for a significant size company in your local jurisdiction, and it turns out they have subsidiaries all over the world in different jurisdictions, and because the parent company is in trouble, they're in trouble as well, and you have to deal with that. So don't think you're just going to stick to your market and the things that you understand and everything's going to be fine. This is an international business that you're getting yourself into if you have any size or complexity in your client base. Okay, so that's something to think about as well. So when does a CRO get engaged? Hopefully, because we've broadened our definition of CRO, hopefully you get engaged by the company pre-filing as an advisor, as a consultant, and you try to go after those three things outside of court. Save everybody the money, save the risk, because very often court processes take a direction that you hadn't thought about beforehand. You try to think beforehand, you get all the professionals aligned. We're going to do this, we're going to head over that way. But there's always an opposing party, right? And there's a judge whose job it is to evaluate the competing claims and the risks and the fairness within, whatever it is that they need to adhere to in terms of law and jurisdiction, right? And you could be wrong. You have confirmation bias, you were too aggressive, whatever it is. So whenever you go to court, you just never know. You never know. You have a sense, but things could go wrong. Whereas if you can try to accomplish these three things, a balance sheet restructuring, an operational turnaround, and the investment banking side of this outside of court, well, you're going to be much better off. So that's the ideal time to be engaged as a CRO, as a turnaround leader, despite the title, okay? And then when you are engaged, you can, as I said before, use a formal court filing as a tool. I cannot get these creditors on board for the restructuring that I want to do, right? It's like herding cats. There's too many of them, or some of them are being too aggressive. I've got 80% to agree to a plan, but the other 20% won't agree to a plan. I have no choice but to throw myself on the mercy of the court and say, please, Your Honor, help me restructure this company. That's effectively what you're doing when you go and seek a bankruptcy filing to restructure your business. All right. And when you do that, you can become a court-appointed or a court-acknowledged Chief Restructuring Officer, even if your title beforehand was not CRO, if your title beforehand was interim executive or what have you, okay? And the beauty of having, the downside of the court process, it's cumbersome, it's expensive, really, really expensive, sometimes prohibitively expensive. And from the From the debtor's perspective, from the company that you're trying to turn around, it's not 100% in your control. All right. But the plus side of the court, the formal court process, is that sometimes you can't do it without that regardless, right? The whole point of that process is to bring everybody to the table and to hash it out. So that's a good thing. But from a purely personal CRO perspective, you then get the protections of the court. And I stole some typical language from a Canadian CCAA filing. And I do want to say before I say this that I did a quick Google search, and I took this from a website paper from a law firm in Toronto, Thornton Grout Finnegan LLP. Thornton Grout Finnegan LLP. I believe their website is TGF. Check that out if you want to. I don't know them at all. I know their name. They're a active firm with good reputation in this space. I just personally have never worked with them, but I don't like to steal people's content and thoughts without at least giving them some acknowledgement. So the types of court protection you could get, for example, neither the CRO nor any officer, director, employee, or agent of the CRO shall be deemed to be a director or officer of the debtor company. This will be in a court order at the end of the day. Neither the CRO nor any officer, director, etc., shall incur any liability or obligation as a result of its appointment or carrying out this mandate. The debtor company should hold all of these people, identify them, and hold them harmless. Any actions or other proceedings against the CRO should be stayed, except with the leave of the court, and the CRO should be permitted to resign, or the debtor company should be able to seek an order terminating the appointment of the CRO. So those are types of protections that a CRO in a court filing, in a formal process, might expect. And as a result, what you see is a bunch of firms that hold themselves out to be CRO, which is true. I don't mean they're not CROs, but they hold themselves out to be CROs. But they only really want to do that work with the protection of a court order, because it goes a long way to indemnify them and hold them harmless against actions. And, turnarounds and restructurings are always an aggressive and litigious exercise. And while I'm at it, I would just say that in a court process, very often, and again, this is jurisdictional dependence, but in Canada, in a CCAA filing, for example, the CRO is an advocate of the company with a narrow mandate to formulate and execute a restructuring plan for the benefit of the debtor company. That's the job, which is distinguished from the monitor, right, which is a court officer, making sure that the court gets its information that it needs, that information is interpreted, that it is, quote unquote, the eyes and ears, end quote, of the court in that situation. All right. So that's sort of how you get engaged as a CRO. And again, don't forget these three key points of a turnaround: a balance sheet restructuring, operational turnaround, and investment banking. And so I've had many examples. I've talked about some of them on this show, where we enter into an engagement letter with the company pre-filing, and that engagement letter specifies the exact roles and responsibilities of each party, specifically the debtor company, your client, and that of the CRO. And then often, if there's a filing after, that sort of gets replicated in the court order, or at times the engagement letter becomes directly or indirectly an attachment to the court order or to the filings that go along with it. For example, our engagement letter is sometimes an attachment to a forbearance agreement, right? A secured creditor, a bank, for example, says, okay, I won't bankrupt you today. I won't put you into receivership. I won't take all your assets and liquidate you. I'll put a stop to that for now under the following terms and conditions. And that contract is called a forbearance agreement. And one of those terms and conditions could be that the company bring in a turnaround advisor or a CRO, and that engagement letter gets stapled to the back as a schedule of the forbearance agreement. And so that happens very often, certainly in my experience. But in that engagement letter, it defines for you, or for us, the specific roles and responsibilities of a CRO. So, and I don't want to say this is template-ish, but it kind of is. Depends on the situation. What you do is you start with a whole checklist of things, and then you delete the things that aren't relevant. But, one of the keys is that the CRO is responsible for developing a plan or plans of restructuring, a restructuring of the business and a restructuring of the assets. And at the end of the day, we often deliver this in a monthly rolling model together with notes, read the assumptions and changes, the assumptions that drive the model and the changes to the overall governance and management of the business that are required to make this new plan take effect. Okay. And that's what a restructuring plan is, at least the way that we present it. All right. And you want your model. I've talked about how to do this. You can look it up on past content on this show, and I'll continue to drill down on that. But basically, if you want your model to be monthly, all 3 financial statements, and you need it to roll out as long as is required to communicate the plan. All right. So if you're looking to restructure debt with a 5-year payback, let's say, well, a 3-year model is not helpful. You need to have, in that case, a 5-year or 7-year model, because that's how long you want this creditor to stay in. Because don't forget, at the end of the day, when you're restructuring, what are you really negotiating? You're negotiating, I owe you 100 cents on the dollar, I will pay you this. I'll pay you 100 cents on the dollar, I'll pay you 10 cents on the dollar, I'll pay you 50 cents on the dollar, I'll pay it in cash, I'll pay it in a combination of cash and some instrument like an equity that gives you some upside so you can recover more if things go well. You participate in the turnaround with us, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing you're saying is, how do you get out? Like, how long? If I'm going to pay you 50 cents on the dollar, when are you going to get that money? Are you going to get it today, or are you going to get it over time, 5 years from now? Is it dependent on cash flows? Is it dependent on the success of the turnaround, right? So what's the quantum? How much are you going to get paid? When are you going to get paid? And what are the protections and changes and risks of the plan to get you paid, right? Those are the 3 things you need to be able to communicate, and you need to be able to negotiate. You can do that all in the context of a financial rolling model and the related assumptions. You want a tip on being a successful CRO, learn how to do that modeling. It's critical. Another point from the engagement letter. So you've created this plan, this restructuring plan. You're in charge now of managing, directing presentations to negotiations with the lenders, creditors, suppliers, stakeholders, potential purchasers, and investors, and any other interested party in connection with this restructuring plan. So the CRO is the lead on implementing and pitching this plan and the negotiations surrounding this plan. And, in reality, you just need to amend that plan nonstop until you can get everybody's consensus, okay? And then implement the plan. So you've created it, you've pitched it, you've got some buy-in, and now you need to implement, managing, directing the implementation of the restructuring plan or plans. Managing and leading communications in connection with the restructuring process. So you're providing updates, press releases, whatever it may be, right, related to this restructuring and turnaround. Generically, it says managing all processes related to the conduct of the restructuring. Coordinating so that all has to do with the restructuring side of this. Remember the 3 things. Coordinating the foregoing restructuring activities with the CEO and other management team members who will be acting on the day-to-day of implementation, and together with the company's existing management, this particular engagement letter says, participate in operational decisions with respect to employees, compensation, product development, investment decisions, supply chain, on and on. So that is the operational turnaround part of this, okay? And I won't read you the third part, but this engagement letter and most of ours also include the investment banking piece to go out and raise the capital to get some of this stuff done. All right, so I'll skip some of the other sort of more detailed company-specific points, but you get the idea. The idea here is the roles and responsibility of the CRO are to create the restructuring plan, to pitch and negotiate the restructuring plan, and then once it's agreed to implement the restructuring plan and to turn around the business and to find the capital that goes along that is required to do that. And then in the roles and responsibility, I just want to point out here that there's an explicit, not even implied, an explicit what otherwise might be a conflict, because as a CRO, you're sort of bridging the gap. You work for the company, but you want to be able to have that one-on-one, private, honest, persuasive conversation with the company's creditors. So often in the engagement letter, we put something like that the company is entering into a forbearance agreement with its senior lender, the terms of which will require the CRO to ensure that it maintains full and open communications with the lenders, their agents, financial advisors, legal counsel, to promptly respond to all requests from the lenders and their various advisors and representatives. The company hereby acknowledges, agrees, consents that the CRO providing the lenders and or their advisors with such communication. So it's specifically in the engagement letter. And so that's maybe too legalese for you at this point to answer your question, but I think it's important to point out that the CRO is often in a difficult bridging position between the lender and the borrower and the lender. Your client is the borrower, your responsibility is the borrower, but to do your job effectively, you need to bridge that gap. You're not there to be combative. You need to lobby for your side. You need to advocate, is a better word, for your side of this equation, but you're not there to be the pit bull. The pit bull should be the litigation lawyers, okay? You're there to get the job done, to bridge the gap and to negotiate between all of these parties. At least that's the way I think about it. Doesn't always go that way, but because you're not there to be pushed around either. You're not there to be abused. You're not there to have your client bullied, which happens sometimes in these situations. And then, you need to stand up to that. But there is a bridging element. And quite frankly, the entire value, or one of the key values of a CRO, is that they can put themselves into that position and tread that fine line successfully. So your specific question was, on top of what is a CRO, is how might one be successful as a CRO? Well, I'm going to say, for me, there's two reasons that I've ever been in trouble as a CRO, or not really in trouble, but haven't succeeded the way I think I should have succeeded. Two primary reasons for that. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Number one, the client motivation is not what I thought it's not what I thought it should be. It's not what I thought it was going to be. And their motivations, more often than you think, are more around failure than success. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but to succeed at a restructuring, you have to be humble. You have to admit when you're wrong. You have to admit that there was errors in the past. You have to embrace change. And if you can't do those things, you're not going to succeed. More often than you think, troubled businesses would rather go down and fail than to change. All right? They don't express it that way. That's not explicit, but psychologically, that is absolutely true. It's absolutely true. They are unable to change. They don't even want to succeed. Or I had one client once that I was CRO, and it turned out that the CRO, me, was really being used as a prop just to get past the next stage in their discussions with the senior lender, and they had more nefarious plans, and that's actually happened 2 or 3 times. And I've come out okay each time, but you're not getting the job you thought you were getting, and that can happen, which leads to my second commonality with every lack of success that I've had, which again isn't often, but it has been a few times, is I haven't had the control over the situation. I've been a CRO, but I've been more of an advisor. And the management team and the board really just could ignore me in those situations. So we couldn't implement change. And of course, you report to the bank everything you're trying to do, to the creditors, everything you're trying to do. But at the end of the day, you're associated with something that's not going to go well. And that's not a position that is happy to be in. By the way, when I go back to the roles and responsibilities of the CRO, I completely skipped one of the most important ones, which is to manage the day-to-day cash flow. Okay. And I don't know how I missed that point on my notes here for you. I talked about the rolling model, the 12-month rolling model, which is in fact the restructuring plan when you combine that with the accompanying notes and action plans in words. All right. But the other point is not running out of money during the process. And the way you demonstrate that is often almost everywhere in what's called a 13-week rolling cash flow. 13 weeks is basically 3 months. And you're going, here's my inflows of cash. Here's my outflows of cash, and here is where we see that we ran out of money, or preferably didn't run out of money. And often, not always, it falls on the CRO to prepare that document, to keep it up to date, to recommend changes to that cash flow. And the reason I remember that now, as opposed to when I was giving you the roles and responsibilities, that's often something that falls into my lack of control. When you get appointed a CRO, but you don't have control over the checks that are being written sometimes. You don't have control over the wires that are going out the door. You don't have control over receivables. So your ins and outs of cash become a problem. And, a hot button in a negotiation with many stakeholders, with many creditors, is the idea that you're always asking for more money. You're delaying payments. This 13-week cash flow is supposed to be addressing that issue in black and white on paper. But if you don't have control over it, you're putting out a document that you have no control over, and it can get you into bad positions. And so whenever I've had trouble, as I said, not outright failures, but things haven't gone the way I want them to go, I can always look back on a postmortem and think to myself, wow, the motivations of this management team is not what it should have been. Okay. And I combine that with the fact that I didn't have the control just to drag it over the finish line to execute myself. That 100% of the time is how I get myself in trouble being a CRO. So you want to be a success? Be mindful of those two things. Additionally, to succeed in this role, you need credibility. And if you don't have it personally, you need to align yourself with professionals that do have credibility. At the end of the day, there's a handful of key things that you need to succeed as a turnaround leader, as a CRO, but one of them is negotiation skills and persuasion. A large part of that is trust. A large part of that is credibility. If I wander into a foreign country and I need to restructure something, do I just sit down on my own and start, talking crap in the wrong language? Is that the right way to go about it? Or do I go and find myself the most high profile, best lawyer in that jurisdiction, not to do my job for me, but to sit beside me and guide me through that particular process, and so that their credibility oozes off onto me for that specific transaction. Okay. You need credibility. If you're a young professional, you don't have it. All right. So you need to think about that. If you're an older professional, don't waste it. Right. You always need to take the high road, be honorable, and that's going to work out for you. You need financial acumen. As I already said, you need this 12-month rolling model. Monthly rolling model for however many years, 3 statement models. If you don't know how to build that, that's a core part of being a CRO. Now, I know that there are lawyer CROs, and there's industry specific, MBA type or executive type CROs, and they have financial people on their team to build these models. That's okay too, but you need to be able to deliver the financial goods in any restructuring. It's a huge part of it. You need legal acumen in terms of restructuring and debt instruments and asset-based lending and, whatever types of debt instruments are relevant, and equity sometimes are relevant to your particular restructuring. You don't have to be a lawyer, but you have to be experienced enough in this to ask the right questions, to come up with the right deal structures on the fly, or you have to have the right lawyers by your side, and that can be really expensive, as you probably already know. You have to have salesman and persuasion skills and negotiation skills. At the end of the day, you've created this restructuring plan. You need to go sell it, and you need to listen to stakeholders' concerns, and you need to try to address these, and you need to try to get them over the finish line. So career-wise, listen a lot. If you're a young professional, listen, be humble, right? Because you don't know everything. And here's an important point on this humility. You know, it's not just about not being a jerk, which is a huge part of this, but no matter where you go, there is a process for these sorts of restructurings. There's a process for this, particularly a formal restructuring, okay? And that process has a limited number of judges. It has a limited number of lawyers. It has a limited number of accountants, right? No matter where you are. And if you're new to that and you're from outside that jurisdiction, you don't know these people, right? And they're not going to change for you. You need to you're a cog in the process, a really important cog, but you're a cog in the process, and you need to find a way to fit into that and to add value. So if I were a young professional, if I was advising somebody on that, you know, be mindful of your credibility, be mindful of your humility, be humble, listen, learn, add value where you can, work on your financial acumen, work on your legal acumen, work on your persuasion skills, and you will be a successful CRO. And it's a fulfilling, highly energetic, rewarding job. If you can focus, if you care about doing deals and saving jobs and saving companies and legacies, there's no better place to be. Thank you for listening. That is Chief Restructuring Officer. Keep those questions coming if you want anything else for me to address. Apart from that, thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next week.